The story of how 168 men conquered an empire begins in November of 1532. One of the most powerful rulers on earth was walking into the city of Kajamara. He wasn't worried. Why would he be? He ruled a massive empire stretching across South America. Millions of people lived under his authority. His armies numbered in the tens of thousands, and waiting for him inside the city were just 168 foreigners. If a battle broke out, everyone knew what would happen. The 168 men would be slaughtered. Instead, what happened next became one of the most unbelievable events in human history. Within hours, the emperor would be a prisoner. Within years, his empire would be collapsing. And somehow, those 168 men would change the course of history forever. But how? How does an empire with millions of people lose to a group smaller than a modern high school graduation class? To answer that, we need to go back a few years. Before the Spanish arrived, the Inca Empire was one of the most powerful civilizations on Earth. It stretched across huge parts of modern-day Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. It was rich, it was organized, and it looked nearly impossible to conquer. But then disaster struck. Smallpox swept through the Americas, killing countless people before many had ever even seen a European. Among the dead was the Inca emperor. His death triggered a brutal civil war between two brothers, Atahualpa and Huascar. For years, the empire tore itself apart. Armies marched, cities changed sides, thousands died. Eventually, Atahualpa won, but by the time the fighting ended, the empire was exhausted. And that was exactly when the Spanish arrived. Their leader was a man named Francisco Pizarro. He wasn't a king, he wasn't commanding a giant army, he was an ambitious adventurer chasing rumors of gold. And when he finally reached the Inca Empire, he brought just 168 men. That's it. A few horses, some firearms, a handful of cannons, and an absolutely insane plan. Pizarro wasn't going to fight the entire empire. He was going to capture its ruler. In 1532, he learned that Atahualpa was nearby in the city of Kajamara. Most people would have avoided a confrontation. Pizarro decided to invite the emperor to a meeting. And surprisingly, Atahualpa accepted. From his perspective, there was nothing to fear. The Spanish were badly outnumbered. He had just won a civil war. What threat could 168 foreigners possibly pose? As Atahualpa entered Kajamara, thousands of his followers surrounded him. The Spanish waited in hiding, watching, waiting, because if their plan failed, they were dead. There would be no second chance. Then the trap was sprung. Cannons exploded. Gunfire echoed through the city. Spanish horsemen burst from hiding and charged into the square. Imagine seeing that for the first time. The explosions, the smoke, the horses, the chaos. Panic spread instantly, but the Spanish weren't interested in fighting everyone. They only wanted one person, Atahualpa. They pushed directly toward the emperor. His bodyguards fought desperately. Many died trying to protect him, but it wasn't enough. By the end of the day, one of the most powerful rulers on earth was a prisoner. And somehow 168 men had done the impossible. At this point, you might think the conquest was over. It was not. In fact, it was just getting started. Because the Spanish had captured an emperor. They had not conquered an empire. Millions of Incas still lived across the region. Huge armies still existed, and many wanted revenge. But first came something else, gold. An unbelievable amount of gold. Realizing how valuable he was, Atahualpa made an offer. If the Spanish released him, he promised to fill a large room with gold. Not a chest, not a wagon, an entire room. Then he promised to fill another room with silver. The Spanish agreed immediately. Over the following months, treasure arrived from every corner of the empire. Golden statues, golden jewelry, golden ceremonial objects, masterpieces that had taken generations to create. The room slowly filled, exactly as promised. Atahualpa had kept his word. The ransom had been paid, and that's where you'd expect the story to end. The prisoner pays, the captors release him, that's how ransoms work. Except that's not what happened. The Spanish had started asking themselves a dangerous question. What happens if we let him go? Atahualpa still had power. People still followed him. If he returned to leadership, everything the Spanish had accomplished could disappear overnight. So after collecting one of the largest ransoms in history, they made their decision. They executed him anyway. The gold was gone, the emperor was dead, and the Inca Empire was thrown into chaos. But the fighting wasn't over, not even close. The Incas still had warriors, still had leaders, and still had every reason to fight back. For years, battles erupted across the empire. The Spanish won some, the Incas won others. Neither side was willing to surrender. And this is where the differences between the two armies became important. Inca warriors fought with spears, axes, clubs, and powerful slings capable of launching stones with deadly force. The Spanish brought steel swords, steel armor, horses, firearms, and cannons. The guns weren't especially accurate, but the smoke, noise, and shock could terrify opponents. The horses were even more important. Imagine seeing armored riders charging directly toward you when you've never encountered cavalry before. That advantage mattered, but even with all their technology, the Spanish nearly lost several times. One of the most dangerous moments came during the siege of Cusco. The Incas gathered a massive army and surrounded the city. Stones from slings rained down, buildings caught fire, warriors attacked from the surrounding hills. Day after day, the pressure increased. For a moment, it looked like the conquest might completely collapse. Everything the Spanish had achieved could disappear, but somehow they survived. Again, the fighting continued for years, cities changed hands, resistance movements emerged. Even after major defeats, Inca leaders continued fighting from mountain strongholds. This wasn't a single battle, it was a long and brutal struggle. Which brings us back to the original question. How did 168 men conquer an empire? The truth is, they didn't do it alone. Disease had already weakened the empire. Civil war had divided it. Some native groups sided against the Incas. Spanish technology provided important advantages, and perhaps most importantly, Francisco Pizarro made one of the boldest gambles in history. Instead of fighting an empire head-on, he went straight for its ruler. And somehow, against all odds, it worked. If the Civil War never happened, if smallpox never arrived, if Atahualpa refused that meeting in Kajamara, history might look completely different today. The Spanish could have been wiped out, the Inca Empire might have survived, and one of the most unbelievable stories in human history would have never happened. But it did. A tiny force crossed an ocean, captured one of the most powerful rulers on Earth, collected a fortune in gold, survived impossible odds, and changed history forever. Nearly 500 years later, it still sounds impossible, and maybe that's exactly what makes the story so incredible.